Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Birds and the Bees podcast. This is Braxton Dutson.
That's the key. People aren't talking about it.
Everybody needs to know that porn is not a documentary.
It's not like if we don't talk to kids about sex and sexuality, they're not going to hear about it. They're just not going to hear about it from us.
They have tons of questions. They just don't know how to ask them.
All you have to do is be one chapter ahead. You don't have to know everything. Just one chapter ahead of wherever your child is.
Welcome to Birds and Bees podcast. This is Braxton Dutson. I'm so excited to have you here today because I have brought on Natasha Helfer-Parker, and we are going to be talking about a topic that I get asked about all the time, which is masturbation. So I'm coming to you with this episode with Natasha to be able to talk about masturbation and values, because this is a combination that I either think one gets thrown out the window or the other. So today, I'm going to be introducing her, but I am so excited to have you with me. If this is your first time being on the show, welcome to the Hive. If this is your 42nd or 43rd, I can't remember what episode we're on, welcome back. We're so excited to have you as Hive mates. Thank you so much. And again, I really appreciate those that have been referring these to friends, family. This is a topic that I guarantee you there is a parent, a friend, a family member that needs to have this information. So please consider sharing this with your friends and family. This helps the podcast a lot. Also, giving us a review helps a lot as well. But we're going to jump right into the episode. So I'm so excited to bring this to you. We're going to be covering masturbation and values. We're going to be talking about religious beliefs, talking about ethical responsibilities for parents to be talking to their children about masturbation. And just know that, yes, I've said masturbation at least, well, what are we at? Maybe 12 times right now. And it is going to continue to be a conversation that we have in this. So with that being said, if you're not comfortable with this, having young ears around, please listen to this in the privacy of with you and your partner, or in a place that you feel more comfortable. But without further ado, let's get on to the episode. All right. Thank you for being here, Natasha. I'm so excited to be doing this episode with you.
Braxton, I'm so excited to be with you. And one of my favorite topics, and I'm so glad you said the word 12 times, masturbation. Woohoo!
I sure did.
And I want to just start out with the disclosure that that's the word I was planning on using. You know, we have a lot of words: self-pleasure, self-touch, solo sex, playing with yourself. Lots of ways we avoid the M word. But it's the clinical term, and it's the term that is most often used as far as, you know, research papers and journal articles and kind of in a clinical forum. So that's the word I'm going to use. And I really also enjoy your kind of invitation for people to sit with something that, is typically uncomfortable. This is a taboo topic. It's usually only mentioned either in kind of joking, kind of crass ways in our culture, or kind of in, you know, the sinful rhetoric, you know, in religious cultures, or silly ways. And we just normally can't have just kind of basic, non-taboo conversations about something that's so normal and so kind of inherent to human beings, regardless of where you come from, what status of life you're in, what culture you're in, what race you're in. And so I'm so glad that you're having me on about this topic.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on, and I'm curious, we've had this conversation so many times as sex therapists, and I don't know if I know the story that's gotten you into being so passionate about talking about sexual health and masturbation, and I mean, how did you get into all this, to this conversation about masturbation with so many people? Because you have this conversation so often.
Yeah, how did I become a masturbation lady? Is that what you're asking me?
How did you become a masturbation lady?
Well, it wasn't what I put on my list as a 10-year-old of things I wanted to become. Yeah, that's a good question. And so thinking about my own history as a marriage and family therapist, I went to school for marriage and family therapy, saw lots of people as couples, parents, individuals. And so, you know, the topic of sex came up, and I happened to work amongst a religious kind of clientele for the most part for most of my career, not all of my career, but for most of my career. And so, in my particular tradition, my faith tradition, masturbation is something that a lot of people have questions about whether or not it falls within their value systems, et cetera. And so I would see a lot of shame coming in through the door, self-shame or partner shame, or a lot of parents really concerned as far as how to talk to their kids about it. And so I started really kind of looking into it myself. And this wasn't just around masturbation. This was a lot of sexual issues in general. So that's what really led me to become a certified sex therapist through the organization ASECT, and which is also the organization you've been certified through. Mm-hmm. And I had to challenge a lot of my own biases, a lot of my own, values, because it's fine to have our values and everybody has the right to their own values, but values are kind of independent, personal things. They don't necessarily show up in clinical studies in the sense of if you have this value, then this can prove this or that. And in fact, where values do show up, it actually shows a bit of a risk for those coming from conservative religious backgrounds. And I'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. But that was what got me going. I kind of, I think as therapists, a lot of times we want to be blank slates. We don't want to say a lot about our own personal ideas or beliefs, because then we might turn off certain people, or, certain people may not be comfortable with us, or we don't want to project our own views onto people who come to see us. Mm-hmm. But I think I just got to the point where I had seen way too many teenagers in particular who were coming in very depressed, very anxious, to the point that they were truly self-harming. And what I mean by self-harm is, cutting themselves or pulling out their hair, or, things that really cause physical harm to their bodies. And much of that was due to this unresolved shame around something that they felt they were either quote unquote addicted to, or that they couldn't control, because like we know, our sexual drives are somewhat cyclical, right? So whether you're kind of quote unquote horny once a week or once a month or every few days or even once a day, that's a cyclical drive that most teenagers, most adolescents are starting to deal with at a very vulnerable age. And so I started advocating in my own faith community, saying, hey, we've got to change some of this rhetoric. We've got to change some of our ideas around how we're talking about masturbation, because we've got these really great kids who are actually very cognizant about their sexual values, who are typically very sexually inexperienced as far as partnered sex, and yet are feeling very, very guilty and almost, self-shaming to the point that they're really becoming sick in the sense of mental disorders of clinical depression and anxiety.
Yeah, and then, like you said, physically hurting themselves and causing a lot of really, really intense distress. I've met with a lot of people who've had a history of that, where they talked about what their sexual experience was like, and it was started with this self-exploration and masturbation, and what the values were, what God felt was, or what's been taught that God believes or demands, and then also what's going on in the body. So I'm excited to explore a little bit more about this. I'm really curious about one of the topics that comes up, or one of the things that I wonder about is, I've heard some people talk about, when does masturbation start? And when do I need to start having these conversations? What's your take on that?
So I actually did a paper on this in college before I was even a psychology student. And you want to know why, Braxton?
Yes, I do.
Because I wanted to know whether or not I was a freak of nature or I was normal.
Oh, so it was personally based. Okay.
Yes, I was one of those that, I remember masturbating from, I can't remember not masturbating. Let's put it that way. So from a very, very early age, 2, 3, 4. And you see that a lot with young girls, who will either kind of grind up against something or rub themselves up against something. Very typical to see that type of behavior, even amongst toddler girls. Mm-hmm. And so I went into the library of my university and figured out where these books were that might talk about this, because this was prior to the internet searches, where it was very easy. So I had to actually go and face the librarian and say I wanted these types of books.
The Dewey Decimal System for masturbation.
Yeah, exactly. But what I found out was that there was actually quite a bit of literature on it, and that kids are really starting to self-stimulate, whether we want to call that masturbation or not, at a very early age. So even in the womb, we see some
in the womb
self-stimulation of the genital areas. So, and then definitely as babies, if you have any sons, I know I've had sons that, you take off the diaper and the first thing they do is, hand goes to penis, right? And like I said, again, the little girls who grind up against things or even touch themselves, it feels good. It's a stress reliever. And I think one of the big things that we need to be careful about as parents is not to inappropriately sexualize our children way before this has any sexual meaning to them. So I think that, touching your genitals as a baby and as a toddler and even as a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old has the type of meaning as does sucking your thumb or pulling on your ear or having a blankie that you touch and you caress. And
like a comfort.
It's a comfort tool, and it feels good because we're not magically born with genitals that, turn on at a certain age. They have nerve endings from the get-go. They feel good from the get-go, and you can even have orgasmic experiences from a very young age, kind of a climax type of experience from a very young age. So all of that is very normal. And oftentimes parents are very hyper stressed about that, not sure if it's normal. I started getting lots and lots of questions on a blog I was writing about, kind of just what do I do when my 5-year-old or 2-year-old, or is this abnormal? Are they hypersexual? These were the questions that I would get from really concerned, well-meaning, loving parents about their kids, because we lack so much in sexual education in this country, and we don't even know what to expect from our own kiddos.
No, and we're very frequently, we're thinking of, we're going to talk about masturbation around the age of 12 to 14. And as you're talking about, whether we're labeling it as, if we're using the word masturbation as a sexual gratification, maybe it's not so much as that, as you're saying, in the womb or as an infant or a toddler or even 8, 9 years old, where there's a pleasurable sense or a soothing that starts to happen at that age. And then I was speaking to a doctor about this, and they were talking about the different hormones that start to be released at certain ages, that roughly around the age of 5 or 6, you start to have the adrenal glands that start to produce hormones that create that touch from a soothing into more of a purposeful, this feels good, this is a way that I do soothe myself. And it's not really until the gonads start to secrete their hormones that we start to see it turn into more of a sexual pleasure, and for the purpose of maybe an orgasm or something along those lines. And it is so easy. I love what you said earlier about we have to watch out as parents to not portray our own, oh my goodness, you're touching yourself, therefore you are becoming sexually deviant, or you're doing something and now you're going to be hypersexual for the rest of your life and I need to stop this right now. We need to take a step back, calm ourselves, and recognize the ages that we're at, and also be able to have these conversations.
Exactly. And I think that at these ages, prepubescent ages, especially, let's say, even preschool ages, this is one of the reasons why I really recommend, and I'm sure you've talked about this prior in your podcast, about teaching correct anatomy, right? Anatomy from a get-go, so that you're saying the words penis, you're saying the words vulva, you're saying the word, testicles or balls or whatever that you're using to make sure that then it's not a big deal when you can talk to your kids about this.
Yes.
So that it's the same as, when we say, well, let's not put your finger in your boogie, in your nose and take out boogies and eat them in front of all the people.
Which happens so often.
Yeah, you can say something similar to if this behavior is happening, because oftentimes kids will generally not necessarily know that this is quote unquote private behavior until older ages, like 4, 5, 6, they might start getting that idea. But 3, 4, 5, not so much. So they might be very comfortably self-soothing in front of a TV show, in front of everybody. And now everybody's feeling awkward or not knowing exactly how to handle it. So it's perfectly fine to tell your kiddos something like, hey, it feels good to touch your penis, just like it feels good to touch your fingers or your toes. But, when we touch our penises or our vulvas, that's something that we do more in private. So, just like we've talked about those being private parts and those parts belong to just you. I'm guessing people have had these kinds of talks, or I would encourage them to have those kinds of talks about genital areas, that these are private parts. These are great parts. These are your parts. These are parts that nobody can touch, unless the doctor, mommy and daddy are around.
Yes.
These kinds of things that we talk to kids about. So if you've had those kinds of conversations, it's very easy then to just continue with self-touch and say, you can do that as much as you want to in your bedroom or in the bathroom. Just not something that we do necessarily in front of other people.
And I think that's where parents...
tone, not shaming.
Yes. And parents... I think this is where the parents have the hardest time. When I'm saying this, there's almost a caveat. It's like, okay, stick with us. We just said you can do this on your own in the bathroom or in your room and wash your hands afterwards. And a lot of parents get really afraid of saying, what do you mean we're just going to give them a license to masturbate? That's against my beliefs, my values. We're taught that we're not supposed to do that. We're not, the natural man, and all these other things start to come up for parents, and they get really, really nervous about saying in a calm voice, hey, we do this on our own. How can we speak to these values when we're also knowing that the body has a natural response to pleasure and soothing, so that we're not shaming our children? I want to piece this apart, and I know that I just asked that question in a simplistic
really?
way, and there's so much to it, but
sure.
Let's start addressing that before we lose some parents to thinking, oh, this is just we're not addressing values. You guys just want us to be, convinced that masturbation's okay, and that's not what we're going for.
Yeah, and I think what I'll say right offhand is that you are having different conversations with your children, starting in adolescence, pre-adolescence, like 10, 11, 12. 14, 15, 16, those are very different conversations than the conversations we just kind of role modeled, which, like I said, is kind of prior to maybe 8, 9, 10. So, so that's one thing. And again, I think that prior to pre-adolescence, most of this isn't necessarily sexualized. It might be romanticized a little bit. Like I said, when I was a little girl, I remember, thinking about Cinderella and the prince, and I might see them kissing, and I remember seeing my parents kissing, and I remember this feeling of, wow, what it must be like to be in love. And I definitely thought of some of those things when I masturbated. So it's not like it was completely devoid of any kind of romantic or relational imagination, but it wasn't sexualized in the sense that you really start becoming a sexual agent and start understanding your sexuality in a much more developed sense once you're an adolescent. So I'm just going to say that, hang in there with us.
Yes.
We will talk more about that, as the kids get older. As far as values and things of that nature, I think it's important to, understand, like even in my religious culture, which is fairly conservative. I mean, I come from a Mormon background. I remember there's a parent's guide that actually points out in that guide that prior to 12 years old, really the guidance from the church is to just kind of normalize it, not make a big deal about it, not shame it. And then again, to start having more in detail conversations about sexuality once they're hitting puberty. So even in my church, there's some leeway there for, again, not making it a big deal when kids are little.
Yeah.
And so I'm guessing, if you come from different cultures or religions, this might be something you could talk to your clergy people about, or, don't make assumptions about that just because you were taught something in regards to your sexuality, through your family system, that's necessarily going to be how all Catholics or all Jews or all Mormons or all Christians think about this particular topic. There's usually some room, even in very conservative cultures to take sex positive approaches, and not, start a very, unfortunately, young shaming cycle, which, we'll talk about this again a little bit later as far as the risks that I'm concerned about, but you can turn the problem into a much bigger problem by giving it way too much energy.
Very much so.
Power, instead of just kind of casually like, yep, that feels good, no big deal, move on. Do it in your bedroom, no biggie.
Yeah, and you can teach hygiene with it. It's a whole part of, wash your hands and don't put your finger in your nose, and we don't touch our vulvas at the table and things along those lines.
Yeah, or at the grocery store.
Or at the grocery store. That's why we keep our diapers on, and we're teaching these principles to these younger kids, and so hang with us on being able to teach your kids these things. And I want to take the caveat and say that it's important for dads to be able to talk about genital touching and masturbation with their daughters just as much as moms need to be able to talk about it with their sons, and interchangeably, that this also can help take away the shame stigma of only girls get to talk about it with girls, only boys get to talk about it with boys. Again, if you can think of your child, as hard as it may be when they're at a young age, of what kind of relationship do you hope they have when, if you're picturing them being in a loving relationship, in a loving sexual relationship, whether that be, if you're hoping that they, stay celibate until marriage, or if they are wanting to find someone that they love, that or that they're sharing the sexual part of them with someone that they love, that we have to kind of think of how do we foster our children to be able to share their full sexual self with somebody. And it is really hard to do that if they have a lot of shame baggage around sexual experiences, which includes masturbation. So keep that in mind as you're trying to teach your children all these things.
Well, and I really like that you bring up how important it is for kids to get messages from both parents, both gendered parents. So, because first of all, there's studies that show that there's much higher levels of sex positivity and self-esteem, higher levels of self-esteem when a child has both parents talking to them about sexual issues, sexual values, whatever it is that you want to talk to them about. And to your point, I think that when we keep the conversations only gender specific, especially for heterosexual kids that then grow up and have to have a relationship with the opposite sex, they've never practiced having a conversation with an opposite sex person, right? So that can make it very difficult for, a young married man to know how to talk to his wife about sex, or a young, heterosexual woman knowing how to talk to her husband about sex. So we want kind of to cross-pollinate, per se, from both parents. Plus, you never know when you have a transgender child as well, that you might be making assumptions about gender and sex that are not actually very useful to your child at all. So, keeping that in mind.
Yeah, most definitely.
So, can I talk a little bit about values?
Yeah,
so this
100%.
This is a tricky one because, I think that for the most part, depending again on what type of religious background you come from, and not that values are tied to religious communities, but I'm just saying in general, religious communities talk about their values in a way that has to do with how that church or that faith community decides is what's okay and what isn't okay sexually. So that's how people, if you ask people, what are your values around sexuality, they'll usually give you a big checklist, and it's usually a do not checklist, on, well, you don't have premarital sex, and you don't masturbate, and you don't look at pornography, and you don't, and you don't, and you don't. And that's what they consider their sexual values. So right off the bat, I would invite people to have a bigger kind of umbrella than that when you think about values. Values are what do we value? What do we think is important? And Doug Braun Harvey, I'm sure maybe you've talked about him on the show before, does a wonderful job about talking about principles of sexual health. When you talk about consent, when you talk about non-exploitation, when you talk about honesty, when you talk about trust and shared values, these are things that are really important that aren't necessarily covered when you say something like, well, you shouldn't have sex until you're married.
Yeah.
Or you shouldn't touch yourself because that's not marital sex. But if that's all you talk about, you really haven't talked about values. You've talked about to-do lists.
Mm-hmm.
So I really invite parents to think about sexual values as a much grander thing than just a to-do or not to-do list. The other thing that I think we just all have to face, and I can't think of any religion, including my own, that hasn't been affected by this. But as far as I know, most of us in religious communities have been led by people.
Mm-hmm.
People who do really good things and yet make mistakes. And I don't know really any clergy or any priests or bishops or any type of religious leader in any kind of religious community that probably wouldn't have to admit that their religion has made mistakes on things. Mm-hmm. And that even if you went back to basic Christianity throughout the Puritan era, like when it was okay to burn witches and when it was okay to, do a lot of things that we would not think is okay today, that the checklists around sexuality have changed over time. Mm-hmm. And that happens in all religious communities. So I would just really invite parents to be critical thinkers when it comes to looking at how does my religious community, how does my faith community think about sex, and where is there possible bias there? Because we do have a lot of history that comes even way before the Puritans that has affected, in particular, Christianity. So you have, lots of Catholic priests and lots of even kind of very early scientists talking about self-pollution, self-abuse,
self-belief, self-abuse.
Vices. There were so many things that masturbation was blamed for that people really thought was true. And I think now we would just think it's silly, right? But masturbation was blamed for insanity. It was blamed for blindness. It was blamed for acne. It was blamed for impotence. This idea that it would diminuate your powers, like your athletic powers or your intelligence powers. It was blamed for a lot of mental health disorders. So, and these were things that were touted by people in authority, people who were clergy people or doctors or scientists of the time. And it wasn't till about, at least in this, in our era, about 1897, that a man by last name Ellis, he was one of the first ones, at least in this kind of era of
in our generation.
Time frame, that normalized masturbation. But that's before Freud, and Freud did not normalize masturbation. He very much pathologized it.
Very much so.
And it was even in the DSM. I think it was the last time masturbation was in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual was in the DSM-2, which means that they were diagnosing with issues around masturbation until 1968. And the American Medical Association finally normalized it as normal human behavior, and only in 1972.
Oh, wow. So that's just recent.
Yeah, so that's fairly recent. So the reason I think it's important for people to understand this is there's, religions don't happen in vacuums. Religions happen within cultural trends and, the times, and they tend to be kind of on the side of sexual conservatism. And therefore, I think that, unfortunately, masturbation has gotten a very bad rap in a lot of our religious cultures for not really a lot of great reasons, because the research doesn't really back up a lot of the worries that we maybe have around how masturbation could be a hindrance, especially to, I think, for most people in religious communities, what they really want is they want good marital sex. They want healthy, good marital sex. They want their kids to not, quote unquote, either ruin themselves or damage themselves or have experiences that they would regret or worry about, that they really want their kids to have a wonderful, engaging, satisfying marital sexual life. And so one of the things I invite parents to think about is a lot of things that we worry about are just not really shown in research around masturbation. And secondly, if we do a lot of shaming around normal sexuality, we unfortunately actually get in the way of exactly what it is that we want the most for our kids. And I just think that this is kind of an unnecessary tragedy.
Yeah, so this is helping trying to get our kids into having that sexual experience that we want them to have as adults, and really working so hard to try and get them what we want them to have that we end up causing more harm than good.
Right. And now we know this through a lot of really interesting research that just has been recently coming out, which, really backs up a lot of my anecdotal experience, right? So that's my lived experience with clients. The number one researcher that comes to mind, although there's several of them now, is Joshua Grubbs. And it's this idea that people who come from religiously conservative cultures are at higher risk for thinking of themselves as sexual addicts or hypersexual or deviant in some way for the same or even less behavior than the normal population.
Oh,
so this is what I mean by people from religious cultures being a more vulnerable population, and why I care so much about this, because these are my people, first of all, and they're also the people I live along, right? Because I live here in Wichita, Kansas, so many of my neighbors are evangelicals and born-again Christians and Baptists and, all of these communities that have some of this kind of sex negative kind of background
a lot of fear.
Their sexuality, which again comes from, I think, really good places. I think most parents want what's best for their kids.
100%.
And they think that they're protecting their kids. And my sadness about it is that I see us actually harming our kids more and putting them at higher risk for shame-induced anxiety and depression, and actually not being prepared for healthy adult sexuality when we are so rigid in our ways of constructing masturbation when they're young.
Yeah, I think the thing that I see the most in trying to protect kids is they either don't talk about it, or two, they talk about it in the negative way, that there's no type of understanding of why a child may be masturbating or anything like that. It's just don't. They may say it as kind of an inside joke because they're uncomfortable, like, oh, you'll grow hair on your hands or you'll go blind or something, kind of as a joke, but the child doesn't know this and there's never a follow-up. And then maybe in certain religious aspects, there's interviews or there's follow-ups on how well you're doing to try and not masturbate, things along those lines, and there's not much taught about it, so a child figures it out on their own or is doing this, and then they're told it's wrong, and then they have a hard time, quote-unquote, stopping, and so then they revert to some really severe actions towards, like you were saying earlier, self-mutilation, consequencing themselves, and parents aren't even aware that this is happening because we're also inadvertently teaching them you can't talk about this because parents aren't talking about it.
Right, exactly. So I think that parents, obviously most of us don't like to think about our kids as sexual beings. Most kids don't like to think of parents as sexual beings, right? So that's a pretty normal thing, which is good because that keeps, issues
it keeps boundaries.
Yes, it's a very good boundary. And at the same time, we know that our kids need education and need good information because there's just so much misinformation, and we don't live in a society or in a culture where, they get very sex positive or comprehensive sexual education with, unless they're talking to their friends, which that's scary.
Oh, yeah.
Or looking at pornography, which that's very unrealistic. And, we want them to have good information. So my biggest concern with the whole masturbation as a sin idea is that you are taking what all scientific bodies now have taken the stance that masturbation is a normal human behavior. So you're taking something that's normal and you're making people feel guilty about it. And then they start a repetitive cycle of failing at stopping something, or maybe they do actually stop themselves from doing something. Some people don't masturbate, but then they become somewhat sexually repressed. And again, that's not very easy to turn back on when you're finally ready to be sexual. And or even, you have a lot of the kids who kind of roll their eyes at us and don't pay much attention to what we think because they think we're stupid. And those kids, to your point, just get it very clear in their heads that mom and dad are just really not going to be the people that I can go and talk to about this. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. They're super rigid about it. They're freaking out every time, we even mention anything about sex. So I'm going to make sure and not go to them about it.
Yeah.
So whether they're actually being harmed or they're just not talking to you about it, regardless, the scenarios are not good.
Yeah.
So I would like to maybe offer a value-centric option for masturbation.
Let's hear it.
See what, people don't have to necessarily agree with me, but I think it's an option. I think that most parents, especially from religious structures, might consider the idea that they don't want their children sexually exploring much before at least a committed or marital relationship. That seems to be a fairly common thing. Mm-hmm. Now, there's plenty of parents that maybe don't necessarily have those values, and that's fine too. I still think that this fits really any parents. So if you can think about the body as an autonomous being that in many ways is self-reliant. Okay, so we can feed ourselves, we can clothe ourselves, we can brush our own teeth. At some point, we can take care of our own sexual drive. Okay, so that is kind of innate within us. Eventually, what we want for our children is and sexual relationship for our children. But we understand that doesn't happen overnight. so they're not going to go from never having done anything or having thought anything sexual to all of a sudden being married, right? They're going to have fantasies. They're going to have dating relationships. They're going to hold hands. They're probably going to kiss somebody. They might even go a little further than that. They may, even if they don't have penis and vagina sex, they're probably going to explore some aspect of their sexuality. And I think it can be really wonderful to tell your children, look, your body has a self-reliant mechanism. And you can, in a sense, if you're not ready to have sex, if you're not, if you feel like you're being pushed into having sex, which can happen for boys and girls, if you feel like pressured by a boyfriend or girlfriend, or if you feel like, you thought you might, but then you back up and you don't, all of these possibilities. One of the wonderful things is that you can always take care of yourself without having to rely on that relational aspect of sexuality until you are ready to. Now, you can invoke your values. You could say something like, I really hope that you decide to wait until you're married to have sex, because part of my value system as your parent is that sex is something so special and so important and something that you share really with only very few people in your life. And what I want for you is for that to be something that you share with the person that you decide to, make a commitment to have children with. That's part of my value system. At the same time, I understand that you have to figure out your own values too. So in the meantime, whether or not you follow my values, here are some thoughts about how you can protect yourself, about how you can have boundaries with yourself. And that goes from anything from, teaching about masturbation. You can always come home and masturbate. You don't have to follow through with anything you're not uncomfortable with.
Yes.
To even offering the ideas such as condoms and safe sex practices in case they do make those decisions that might actually go even against their own values. Just because children or teenagers have sex doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have values or don't have ideas about what they should or shouldn't be doing. But that doesn't mean that we all follow our values all the time. I mean, if I followed my values all the time, I'd be a lot thinner. I'd be a lot nicer. I would never yell at my kids.
Me too.
I would be like, super mother disciplinarian, right? I mean, most of us fail at keeping even our values that are very important to us. So we want our children prepared for decision making, that they're going to be in this kind of 10-year space of deciding how they're going to navigate their sexual lives. And we don't want them unprepared. We know that, unwanted pregnancy and STI rates go up exponentially the less educated children are about sex.
Yeah.
Also sexual assault and inability to really understand consent also go up by not having comprehensive sexual education. So this idea that if we talk to our kids, they're going to be more sexual, actually the research really now supports the opposite of that.
Yeah,
so,
the complete opposite. They get to now have informed decisions, and they make those decisions because they're building their own value system. And that's great.
That's right.
I love what you're saying about making your own, seeing all the options that can be put out there, that they get to decide if they do not want to, the reason they do not want to masturbate, or if they are, it's because of a certain thing, or they get to see their values in their sexual life. And it's all based on the relationship. What I love most about this is, anecdotally, again, I work with a lot of couples and a lot of individuals who come in saying that they experience a sexual, something that they are not enjoying when it comes to sexual health. And when someone comes to me and there's been this battle between desire and sexual expression, and all this from teenage years all the way to their married life and way into married life, that either one, masturbation comes up as a huge surprise and a betrayal within a relationship. That someone is saying, whoa, I cannot believe that you did this even as a teenager or even in the relationship. They haven't had this conversation. And so there's a lot of hurt and pain that comes up within the relationship once the disclosure happens. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be a disclosure. That this should be something that we're just talking about of, what is your relationship with masturbation? And what do we want our relationship to have that includes masturbation? Is this something that we can do together, or with how do we want it in our sexual relationship? And there's also a lot of pain that is not being discussed because it's just something people hang on to themselves, and kids are taught from a young age that we just don't talk about it. And it really creates a lot of damage within a relationship later on in life. But I love the way that you're talking about it, saying, hey, this can be a part of the relationship that needs to be talked about.
Yeah, and one thing that you're really kind of bringing up in this idea is that for some reason, the way we have romanticized Western relationships is almost a weird sense of ownership. Like, I own you and you own me. And what I do with my own body, you have a right to tell me I can or cannot do that. And I think that this really speaks to a lot of problems with consent to begin with. Mm-hmm. So parents start by telling kids, you should or shouldn't touch your own body. A lot of professionals in our field actually, would really kind of take more extreme language than I'm even taking, and call that almost a form of abuse, because you're, in a sense, trying to control something that is not yours to control. Mm. And whether or not you want to go to that extreme, I think that there is something to pause and think about, that, if I want my young daughter to be able to say no, or if I want my young son to be able to have boundaries around his sexuality, but I am, in a sense, controlling their sexuality from a very young age, what message, what double standard am I really offering the child? And if you have, kids who come from these religious cultures where they've been made to feel so ashamed about something that's very normal about their lives, and then entering marriage with these very false, unrealistic expectations that, again, have to do with ownership. I now get to be upset about something that you did even before you even met me. Yeah. Or I get to be upset or dictate how you're going to manage your sexuality for the rest of your life, even though I may not have the same libido as you, even though I may not have the same sexual tastes and preferences as you, even though I may not always, be ready to go like you are, So masturbation can actually be a very helpful tool for marital relationships, in helping them manage the many differences that happen in adult sexuality when you're in a monogamous relationship and you're kind of, stuck is probably not the right word, but you're kind of stuck with one another, right? Like, you're the one I decided I would have sex with, and you're the one that's kind of there for that purpose. And so, but we don't match in all those ways. And if now you're going to be upset with me because I decided to, touch my own body a certain way, you can really start getting into this weird ownership issue that's very controlling, actually.
Yeah.
And when you start thinking even about abuse, relationships, and domestic violence, most of us, again, wouldn't put that into that category because I think it's just so common for us to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But it really is a very controlling behavior. And I think we really need to, again, pause and think about, is that the relationship we want our adult children to have with their own bodies? And do we want their spouses feeling entitled or, in some way able to control those aspects that can be very personal and private?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a whole nother conversation, but I think that there are a lot of benefits to masturbation. And I always think about, by the fruits you shall know them, as far as my own spiritual background, right? And I mean, there's a lot of really wonderful fruits. So we know that masturbation helps relieve stress. It helps you sleep. It helps relieve pain, even chronic pain, even menstrual pain. We know it allows for knowledge of one's own body. And for women in particular, this can be very important to avoid issues of anorgasmia or not knowing how to orgasm. It helps provide boundaries. It can be a mood booster. It can be an immunity booster. It can boost your confidence and body image. It's great cardiovascular exercise. It helps with pelvic floor strength, and it's the safest sex around. The safest sex.
Sex.
Yeah. There's a lot of benefits. I think that, I'll just talk a little bit about maybe what people are worried about, right? So let's talk about some of the myths that are out there. So if kids masturbate, somehow they're going to become, I'll just kind of try to think about the.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I was like the pornography one.
Let's think. So they first of all, if kids masturbate, they're going to be selfish. They're going to only want to have sex with themselves. They're not going to want to have sex with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2 is that it's going to lead to pornography habit. Number 3 is that they're going to prefer to masturbate instead of go out on a date or things like that. Number 4 is masturbation will lead to, inappropriate thoughts or, objectifying women or men in a sexual way. I don't know. Those are kind of the ones that I can come up with. Anything that you can think of, that it can become addictive. That
the addictive one. If
you start doing it, you're going to not be able to stop doing it.
I think a lot of it starts to move into the subjective realm of things. I get a lot, how do I know if my child's masturbating excessively, too much, or what do I do if they are? And usually I'm telling parents or clients that I'm meeting with that if it takes quite a lot to get to the excessive realm where we're saying like maybe they're, hours and hours of masturbation, or they're causing the masturbation's happening so much that there is skin problems or things along those lines. And I always tell them to ask further questions. It tends to be a question to be asked of, oh, what do I do if they're masturbating excessively? Well, let's find out what's going on. Find out what is, what is this masturbation for? Is it to self-soothe? Is it because they're bored? Is it because, what is the reason? Let's start getting curious about what is happening and not get so caught up on too much and how much is enough, and is it this many times a day or this many times a week, or what is too much, but to really say, if I'm curious about it, maybe I need to be having some more conversations and explore what experiences my child's having.
Yeah, and the reality is that if you're coming from a background where you really feel like masturbation is quote unquote a sin or it shouldn't be happening at all, the spectrum isn't going to be very helpful to you, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're going to feel like, well, any of this isn't something I'm uncomfortable with as a parent. And, you can have parents and it's very subjective. It's very subjective. Like some people might think like, oh my goodness, somebody's masturbating once a day. That is excessive. Mm-hmm. Whereas other people are like, oh my goodness, if you're masturbating once a month, that's excessive. And there's people that really believe those kinds of things. So just, taking off any religious hat I might have on, just from a clinical perspective, I just want to let people know that masturbation is clinically seen as a normative behavior. So even people who masturbate 2 to 4 to 5 times a day are not necessarily going to be seen as excessive masturbators. Now, if you're masturbating in a way that's it's getting in the way of something else you want to be doing. For example, you might have a kid who would prefer to stay home and masturbate rather than go on a date. But I really doubt that that's masturbation's fault. I think that's a social anxiety's fault, right?
Yeah, totally.
Or you might have a kid who is soothing through masturbation, but when you start really talking to that kid more, it's not just through masturbation or the masturbation's the problem. Maybe this kid is depressed, and that's one of the many ways that they're dealing with masturbation. And it's actually probably a healthier way that they would deal with depression. But again, if they're in their room, it's kind of like it's getting in the way of their lifestyle, their goals, their ways of living life, their dating. My concern with how the criteria is set up currently, and I bring this up every time I'm at a conference, and Braxton, because this is when you want to get away from me, is that the criteria is, does it cause distress? That's one of the criteria. And my concern with that language is that, again, specifically for religiously conservative people, you will have behavior that's much less than the normal population, and it's still causing a huge amount of distress.
Yes.
Because, again, the expectation is zero tolerance. Shouldn't be happening at all, which, again, is for most people an unrealistic expectation. For most teenagers, it's not realistic. So these kids are, quote unquote, failing. And so the distress is high, and the narrative, the story they're telling themselves about this is very distressing, because the story is, I can't control myself. I can't stop. I must be addicted. I must be out of control.
My sins come back to get me. Yeah, Satan's tempting me.
There's an evil spirit. There's something wrong and dirty about me. I'm perverse. So yeah, I would be distressed, if I have that narrative. And one thing that I like to say, this is why I think it's so important for those coming from religious communities to really step back and step into this kind of discomfort of listening to something like this, is, I started my career working with cocaine and heroin addicts. And I will tell you that cocaine and heroin, they don't really care if you're Catholic, Jewish, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, atheist, agnostic. They kind of treat you all the same.
The exact same.
So if you are going to, take cocaine, and if you become an addict, if you become dependent on cocaine, your religious background is not going to have very much of a say on what that looks like. However, with things that have to do with sexuality, we have huge differences, so that kids who are masturbating, even, several times a day, even watching pornography, which this isn't really about pornography, but maybe their values are not really too high on whether or not they should watch pornography. They don't really care. So if their religious values don't make a big deal about those things, or they don't have religious values around those issues, and they do them, they still have good dating experiences. They still have good marital relationships. They still have good grades. They still can do athletics correctly. There's not like this, evidence that kids who are looking at porn and masturbating are somehow having a horrific life experience. And yet so many of our religious kids are having high levels of distress for these same behaviors. And so that's something that we need to look at from an ethical, responsible, critical thinking perspective as both clergy and parents when it comes to how we think about our values and how we're imposing them on our children, and what types of effects they're having long-term into their long-term marriages and sex lives.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And when it comes to what you're saying, I think this ties right into, we're trying to teach, as of right now, there's a lot of parents who are trying to teach these do nots, if you will. And it's being taught through no conversation. I mean, what you're just saying is we need to make sure that we're talking to our children. We need to make sure that we're not throwing into this shame and creating a shame spiral, even with the values that we have, being able to help support the values that you hope to have, but have a conversation about it. And I think one of the hardest things, one of the first barriers parents come to is that they think, this is the hardest conversation I could ever have with my kids. Sex, and then we're going to talk about masturbation. They don't want to hear from me, and I don't want to hear it from them. And so we're just not going to. We're just going to let the clergy talk about it. We're going to let school talk about it. We're going to put off little side things, little side comments of like, oh, better not do that. That's bad. Control it. And we're leaving it out.
Helping kids, talking to your kids about what you hope they do can be a great thing. I hope that you date. I hope that you have relationships. I hope you fall in love. Yeah. I hope you have your heart broken a few times. I hope that you, if you have regrets about how far you've gone, that you learn from those things, that you learn how to know what your body and what your mind is ready for. If I have concerns about masturbation, it would be that, again, that you not use it as a way to avoid social situations, that I would hope that you feel comfortable in dating. And if you don't, what's that about? Because it's probably not about masturbation. And if you have, the reasons why maybe I don't want you to look at pornography is because it's super unrealistic and your brain isn't even fully developed. And that's kind of meant for adults. It's adult entertainment and it doesn't really set you up for good expectations around sex. And so I don't want you to have to mess with all of that stuff in your mind. These are ways that parents can talk to their kids without it necessarily being, just about sin or not sin or God and not God. It can be like, what I hope for you. What I hope for you is that you'll have experiences, that you will learn about yourself, that you will know that you can always take care of your own needs without, giving in or doing anything that you're uncomfortable with. And even if you do cross that line, that you can, use that quote unquote mistake or regret as a learning opportunity so that then you're better prepared for the next time. And if you would even use me as a resource, or if you don't want to come to me, what about Aunt Matilda, right? Or Uncle Joey or this, set up a mentor in their lives so that they can, we can go and talk to that person. That's the person that you can go talk to about things that maybe are uncomfortable for you to talk to me about, because I get it. I'm your mom, or I'm your dad, and maybe it's too much to expect that you would talk to me about those things. I think another big important thing that I always like to end with is repair attempts. Most of us have made mistakes as parents in talking to our kids about sex. We weren't taught very well. We weren't offered great role models.
Yes.
We weren't given comprehensive sexual education. So please be kind to yourself. And a repair attempt can go a long way, which is just saying you're sorry. Saying, hey, I think that I overreacted. Or when I think about, when you were little and you would touch yourself, I would kind of freak out. And I don't know if that had an impact on you or not, but I'm owning that right now. And I just want you to know that I wish I would have done it differently. I wish I would have known things in a different way.
Yeah.
That kind of dialogue can open up huge trust and huge possibilities for dialogue going forward.
So much. I love repair attempts because we can always go back. We're not doing things perfectly the first time. It's the best time to start is right now and keep moving forward with it, knowing we're not going to do this perfectly. Love that.
And even with adult children, because you don't know the sexual issues they may be having in their adult life.
It could heal.
By you coming and saying, hey, I'm not sure that I gave you the tools when you were younger. And I'm sorry about that. That can offer them some healing that you may not even really fully comprehend what that might open up as far as possibilities for them moving forward.
Very much so. Push through that uncomfortability. You can do it.
Yeah.
I was going to say he essentially answered the llast question that I normally ask anyone. Like, well, if you could leave someone with, leave these parents with something. But I so appreciate you leaving him with that, because the repair attempts, so important. And Natasha, I really appreciate you being on the episode to handle such a conversation that could be so difficult and have so many questions surrounding it. I really appreciate you being on to answer these questions and to go over this.
I'm so glad you'd have me on. I love talking about it. I think it's a super important topic. I think that sometimes we poo-poo it or think it's no big deal. But I think for many people, it's the beginning of their sexual development. It will probably be part of their sexual development and sexual life for the rest of their lives. And I really think it's a tool we need to use in a healthy way that fits in with our value systems instead of seeing it as this occult evil thing that is very intrinsic to us, and then we're enemies with ourselves. So I'm a big believer that this is a great way that we can start sex positivity in our own lives and also in the lives of our children.
Definitely. Well, thank you again. I look forward to having you on again. I imagine that I do want to talk to you about masturbation in relationships, and that will be a conversation for another time.
Awesome. Anytime, Braxton.
Thanks, Natasha. All right. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Hive mates, really appreciate you tuning in. Looking forward to talking with you in the next episode. Until then, we'll see you later. This has been another episode of the Birds and Bees podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions about the show, comments, or questions you would like addressed in another episode, please give us a call at 385-449-1818. Leave your voicemail and your question, or you can also email us at birdsandbeespodcast@gmail.com or visit us online at birdsandbeespodcast.com.